Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Internet Policy Conference. We have next session, which is on digital challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. First speaker is Gaurav Verma from Georgia Institute of Technology. Mr. Gaurav Verma is a third-year PhD student in computer science at Georgia Tech, where he's advised by Professor Srijan Kumar. He developed robust and trustworthy machine learning methods that can fuse information from different modalities to solve problems that impact safety, equity, and well-being on the web. He will be speaking on the topic, the impact of online exposure to COVID-19 misinformation on mental health. There will be two sessions in this part. Each session will be for 30 minutes, and we'll be spending some time for Q&A in the after two sessions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gaurav Verma, and it's a pleasure to be here at the Oxford Policy and Politics Conference. I'll be talking about the impact of online exposure to COVID-19 misinformation on mental health. And this presentation is based on the findings of a paper that was published in Scientific Reports last year. And I led the study while collaborating with researchers at Georgia Tech, Ankur, Dr. Talaya, Professor Manman, and Professor Srijan Kumar, who is also my advisor at Georgia Tech. So before I get started with the topic, a quick introduction. I'm a computer science doctoral student at Georgia Tech, and my primary research interests are in developing robust artificial intelligence that can help make the internet a safer, equitable, and healthier place. Even though most of my research interests align with computer science, I have also started working with policy scholars while I'm pursuing a minor in public policy. So it's great to be at an interdisciplinary conference that bridges computer science and policy. To get started with the topic of today's presentation, here's a brief context. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty, even within the scientific community, and that led to a breeding ground for misinformation. People talked about all sorts of misinformation, right from Bill Gates to thinking of 5G as the potential, as the reason why COVID-19 is spreading, and they made up cures which had no scientific backing. And from existing literature, we know that when individuals are anxious, they forage for information, and in the process become more susceptible to misinformation. And that's one way causal link that has already been established given the prior studies. So people, when they feel anxious, they forage for information, and in the process, they are ready to believe information which may not be true. What we wanted to do in our study is we wanted to study the other direction of this potential causality. We were curious to find out what happens to the mental state of individuals when they are exposed to online misinformation. And the reason why we think it is important to study the impact of misinformation on anxiety is because if we do end up finding evidence that misinformation impacts anxiety, we have indications of a vicious cycle, which is what I try to show here. You have anxious individuals who forage for information and in the end end up believing more misinformation. But if misinformation also impacts anxiety, and if we can show there's a causal link there, then we have a vicious cycle where people who are anxious end up feeling more anxious after being exposed to misinformation. So with that goal in mind, we conducted a computational study to establish this causal link. And before the study, there had been speculations by clinicians and practitioners, but there was no scientific evidence for this effect. So as I was saying, we conducted the first large-scale data-driven study to find this out. And our study goal is spelled out here. We wanted to carry out a massive quantitative analysis to study the causal impact of exposure to misinformation on experienced anxiety. Massive because we worked with about 80 million Twitter posts from about 80,000 Twitter users, And this was done during an 18-month duration. So that's 1.5 years of study duration, some of which covered post-COVID periods and some of which covered pre-COVID periods to sort of build controls. Now, we don't want to study simply the correlation between being exposed to misinformation and experiencing more anxiety, which is why we adopted a causal inference framework that uses potential outcomes. And I'm going to talk about the framework in a bit. Now, we want to understand what's the impact of exposure to information, but given the signals that we have from platforms like Twitter, Facebook, it's very difficult to understand unless we are working from Twitter or Facebook. It's very difficult to understand whether someone was exposed to misinformation, which is why we use sharing of misinformation as a proxy of exposure. And the way we identify whether someone is sharing misinformation is using state-of-the-art language models to detect whether a post contains misinformation about, let's say, Bill Gates, 5G, or potential cures in the context of COVID-19. And once we have identified what is misinformation and who's sharing it, we want to finally quantify how people express anxiety in their social media posts. And again, for this, we used some classifiers which were developed while working with clinicians. And these classifiers have been found to be accurate and generalizable across multiple social media platforms. And what they can give us is essentially an anxiety score from any social media post out there. Now, I'm going to quickly talk about the statistics of our study. The core of it is around matching-based causal inference. And here's an image that we'll dissect in the next few minutes and try to understand how we can use data that we get from platforms like Twitter or Facebook to establish causal links between variables of interest, right? Here, the variables of interest are being exposed to misinformation, which is proxied by sharing it. And finally, the outcome variable of interest is experienced anxiety, which is reflected in the posts that users are putting on these platforms. So the reason why we want to use matching-based causal inference is because we want to divide users into control and treatment group, and we want to ensure that the behavioral properties of users across these two groups match. So we start by collecting all the COVID-19 related Twitter posts on Twitter and essentially going through each of these 80 million Twitter posts and categorizing them as containing misinformation or not. Now, if you think of humans annotating 80 million posts, that's going to take forever. But the thing about machine learning or artificial intelligence is these classifications can be automated to a great extent while preserving the accuracy of categorization to a great extent. So we collect all the 80 million tweets on COVID-19, categorize them to identify which of these contain misinformation. And by doing that, what we did was to categorize users into two sets. One set contained users that had shared misinformation, and the other set contained users that did not share any misinformation. Now, if we have users in these two categories, you could say that we have a treatment group and control group. But essentially, if we are sampling our subjects from Twitter, the variability in their behavioral attributes is going to be huge, which is why we employ two-level user matching to sort of create these subgroups where only the matched users are included within a subgroup. And the way we do that is we look at what kind of linguistic attributes these users have on the platform, what type of behavioral attributes these users have on the platform. For instance, how many times do they tweet in a day? Which location of the world are they located in? What kind of language do they use? What kind of words do they use? And if we control for these attributes for a large number of users, or we get these subgroups where we have users from both the groups, treatment and control, but they have been matched for their behavioral, linguistic, and Twitter-related attributes. Now, what we do is, within each of these subgroups, we quantify the treatment effect. It's helpful to recall that some of these users shared misinformation while the others did not. And this is when the outcome variable comes back. And what we want to see is, once the users shared misinformation, are they experiencing more anxiety than they did before sharing misinformation? And how does this number compare against users who never shared misinformation? So if I break down this equation, you would see that we take the increase in anxiety after sharing misinformation for the treatment group and see how much higher it is with respect to the increase experienced by the control group after receiving a placebo around the same date where the misinformation counterpart shared misinformation. And even if you sort of like feel confused at this point, I believe it's helpful to just realize that if this number is greater than 0, that would indicate that treatment user within that subgroup are worse off in terms of anxiety. And a value less than 0 would mean that users who did share misinformation are better off than people who did not share misinformation. So let's look at the results. What I'm plotting here is essentially the same TE relative values that I showed here. And to understand the graph better, I have sort of tried to dissect it. Again, if the value comes out to be 0, we see that there are no effects on anxiety levels, which essentially means that users who shared misinformation are equivalent to the users who did not share misinformation in terms of experienced anxiety. If it's less than 0, that would mean that people who do share misinformation are better off. And if it's greater than 0, that would mean that anxiety level in people who are sharing misinformation is worse than people who are not sharing misinformation. If we plot the values, the treatment effect values for each of the groups shown earlier in this plot, what we see is that the average comes out to be 2.011. What it means is that on average, across all the subgroups that I talked about, people who share or are exposed to misinformation experience twice as much anxiety post sharing misinformation when compared to people who do not share misinformation. And even though there are some subgroups where the effect is opposite, for a large number of subgroups, these effect is overwhelmingly positive, which hints us at the possibility of experiencing worse anxiety levels after being exposed to misinformation. That's sort of the main result of our paper, but we also want to understand whether these experienced outcomes are uniform across different demographic axes, or are some genders or races more vulnerable than the others. So for this part of the study, we sort of restrict our user base to US specific users. And the reason for that is because we do have data and methods to sort of map names of people to what gender or race category they belong to. And I do understand this is noisy and we're only considering binary gender, but this is sort of the first study on the topic, which is why we use what we have to sort of indicate some of the initial patterns, and then we dig in deeper by using more involved methods. The way we map the names of the users to their inferred gender or race is by looking at Social Security Administration data from the US, as well as the US census data. And now we can infer binary gender of people and race. What we find is, if you look at gender as the distinction between demographic axes, women face worse anxiety outcomes than men. And this is within the group that shares misinformation. So each of these individuals have shared misinformation, they have shared worse anxiety, but it turns out that women experience worse even more anxiety than men who are similar in terms of behavioral attributes. If you look at the other demographic axis, which is race, we find that minority groups in the US, Blacks, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Hispanics face worse anxiety outcomes than whites. And again, the way to infer these findings is still the same. All of these people did share misinformation and did face worse anxiety outcomes, but it was worse for people who were from minority groups than people who were from racial majority in the US. So coming to the implications of this finding, and I think this is the slide where I'd be spending most of my time. We have another study that I sort of don't cover, but where we show that people who are not as educated as others experience worse anxiety outcomes than people who are more educated. And that finding sort of hints us at the importance of educating people in terms of how to see misinformation, how to be aware of misinformation, how to verify whether the information is correct or not, especially in the context of COVID-19, where the topic is evolving as fast as it did, and even the scientific community was surprised. It's sort of important that people focus on individuals who may not be as educated as others, because given the same factors, they are likely to experience worse outcomes than people who are educated. The study that I discussed is the first study that computationally shows the adverse effect of being exposed to misinformation on mental health. And as I was talking about this earlier, prior studies have already shown that anxious individuals seem to forage for information and in the process become more susceptible to it. But now we have a study that also shows being exposed to misinformation causes worse anxiety. And this overall hints at a vicious cycle where anxious individuals are likely to become more and more anxious as they're exposed to more and more misinformation. Certainly in the events when like COVID-19, pandemics and crisis, there are direct impacts. A lot of people are directly impacted when these crises occur. But our studies hints at indirect implications of these pandemics and crises, because it's likely that even though someone was not exposed to COVID-19, they were exposed to misinformation related to COVID-19, and that affected their mental state. We also witness worse impact on women and racial minorities. And the part that I did not cover in this presentation was worse impact on people who are less educated. During the span of the pandemic, there have been several studies that argue why women and racial minorities experienced disproportionate impact in comparison to men and racial majorities in those respective states. But as I was talking about the direct and indirect impacts, there is again an indirect impact which is also disproportionate among these demographic axes. So as the first study that sort of establishes the mental health costs of engaging or being exposed to misinformation, we sort of believe that social media platforms should consider these findings and the differentiability in the outcomes, experienced outcomes across different demographic axes while designing their curation and recommendation algorithms. So it's important to protect everyone from misinformation, but it doesn't impact everyone equally. We see that some people are impacted more than others. And these sort of findings can be taken into consideration while deciding which feeds to curate more carefully than the others. And even if this can be done algorithmically, I believe there are people who would there are a lot of fact checkers right now who sort of prioritize which facts to check. And the current state of using fact checking to stop misinformation is that there are not enough fact checkers if compared to the amount of misinformation out there, right? So the fact checkers can prioritize health-related misinformation in comparison to other misinformation, because we did see that health-related misinformation directly impacts mental health of individuals who are exposed to it. The last bit that I did want to talk about was AI-generated misinformation and the potential adverse impacts it could have. I'm sure many of you would have heard about ChatGPT or AI-generated algorithms that can solve a lot of tasks quite phenomenally well, right? But these are specific tasks, and in the process, the models tend to generate minute things which are not as factually accurate as some of the other things that they generate. These models also have a tendency to sound very confident. So while they are saying something which is factually inaccurate, they tend to sound confident, which puts people at the risk of believing them without even looking for an evidence. And as AI-generated content comes into the picture, the findings sort of imply that this misinformation, the process of spreading misinformation, could be automated to a great extent. And in the process, people would be the one who would impact adverse mental health outcomes. So yeah, that's it for the presentation. I think I took less than I was supposed to, but I'll be happy to answer any questions or anything that people would like to discuss. I'll also be happy to answer questions offline. My email address, website, and Twitter is on the page.
Healy from University de Montfort. He will be speaking on the topic, the contradictions of our digital lives, protesting during the COVID-19 lockdowns. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I've got okay, there we go. Had an image up there of a plane on fire, not sure why. Anyway, I'd just like to start off by saying thank you very much to the organisers of the conference for asking me to present my research. I've been researching the digital technologies, the social implications of digital technologies for several years, but using a Marxist framework to do so. And this presentation is based on one of the chapters of my latest book, which is called Organising During the Coronavirus, The Contradictions of Our Digital Lives. This book was based on research undertaken from a number of organisations on an international basis. It included labour organisations, mental health groups, mutual aid groups, people working in creative arts, and protest movements. And I approached this research using conceptual tools inspired by Marxist theory of alienation and Gramsci's theories concerning good sense, hegemony, and the role of intellectuals. Those were the kind of defining impulses which informed the research. I'd like to say a little bit about how the research developed, because when the first lockdown happened, I was concerned, because of my background, I was concerned about how trade unions were going to react to the lockdown. Wait a second, I'm just going to put my lockdown. And then when I started talking to trade unionists, I found out they were also interested in art, and that had an impact. The lockdowns had an impact on artwork. When I started to talk to artists, I began to realize they're also interested in mental health. And when I started talking to people involved in mental health, other issues started to emerge. And then, of course, in the middle of all of this, in May 2020, with the death of Floyd George, the Black Lives Matter movement just exploded crosses onto the streets. And then I realized I had to talk about about protesting under COVID. So that's how the book developed. I could have covered a whole range of other issues, climate, women's movements, etc., but I couldn't. I also wanted to, in my research, I wanted to let people tell their stories. I wanted them to describe their experiences and to try, and also in describing their experiences, to talk about how they related to or used digital technologies. And so in this way, I reached out to the works of people like Studs Terkel in his numerous books on interviewing people. And I can talk a bit more about how that research developed later on if anybody wants. This presentation is primarily concerned with several protest movements that occurred during the pandemic and in the lockdowns. Now, the first thing to say about the lockdowns is that it would seem to be that at that moment there was an enforced isolation. There was restricted, rigorous social distancing. But the contradiction was that the lockdowns also created a situation where people had to look outwards. If you think about the emergence of mutual aid groups, millions of mutual aid groups were set up, involving thousands and thousands of people to both receive and give support. It also goes the same for protests. After a brief pause, there was a whole series of protests that came up into the streets. Now, I know there were some that were protested against government measures. They were anti-COVID, there's no doubt about that. But most of the protests that took place either happened as a result of events during the COVID pandemic, or were a response or a continuation of previous disputes. Health workers in Myanmar protesting against a military dictatorship. Colombians demonstrating against tax increases, poor social services, and police violence. And the Lebanese October movements. These are just three of a multitude of protests that occurred during the pandemic. And you wouldn't know this if you were listening to the news at the time. In other words, COVID-19 did not mean a cessation of societal conflict. In fact, it did the opposite, actually. It exposed the deep structural, economic, and health inequalities that exist on a global scale. Just read any reports from the World Health Organization at the time, and you'll see this. The chapter in my book, which is concerned with protest movements, chapter 6, I looked at 4 different areas. I looked at Black Lives Matter, because as I say, on the 25th of May, 2020, over 7 minutes, George Floyd was murdered by police officers. That drove people, thousands, millions of people out into the streets, not just in America, but across many, many countries. I looked in three particular groups. I looked at Atlanta Justice Alliance, Black Lives Matter New Jersey, and Black Lives Matter Minnesota. At the same time, in London, a woman called Sarah Everard was murdered by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. And the police response to that was, women should stay at home. That drove women out of the home into activity. And therefore, I talked to an organization called Sisters Uncut, which were heavily involved in those demonstrations. I also spoke to people in Nigeria. There is a massive movement going on in Nigeria by women, mainly by women, who sell products, goods in markets. The Nigerian government is trying to privatize those public spaces to build big, huge supermarkets and the like. It's an ongoing, and it was ongoing during COVID. And then finally, the one I looked at was about the Indian farmers' protest. This was a protest which was concerned about the imposition by the Indian government to impose neoliberal farming practices on the farming community in India. It actually led to one of the biggest protest movements ever seen. And I did this by talking to somebody who was reporting the protests, to somebody who was supporting the protests, and somebody who was building the protests. And I can talk about in detail about each of these if you want me later on. Well, in this brief introduction, hopefully it's brief anyway, I want to talk about some of the themes that emerged when I was discussing the issues with the protesters. The first thing was that there is this movement from below. When we looked at COVID and the news on COVID, it was all about governments. It was all about government policy. You wouldn't know that there was this massive movement from below, meaning millions of people were in motion at the time when people were saying, oh, you should stay at home, you should be locked down. And it was building upon a tradition of grassroots action to expand and build networks of protest during this period. These movements also challenged the common sense policies that were being adopted at the time. I mean, governments like Boris Johnson and also Macron in France were saying it's common sense. Common sense will see you through this pandemic. People knew, to a certain extent, it refers back to the previous presentation, people knew, no, there was something terrible going on here. There was real problems happening, and simply saying it's common sense, wash your hands, is not gonna solve the problem. At the same time, the imposition of the lockdowns as they occurred, funnily enough, also created the space, because people were not at work, for people to go out onto the streets. That's why there were so many people involved initially in the Black Lives Matter movement, because many people have been told to stay at home. When George Floyd was murdered, they went out into the streets. So you have this issue, this contradiction going on in the middle of the COVID lockdowns, where people are supposed to be isolating, but in fact they're not. Now, of course, in this process, all this activity, the pandemic also encouraged the greater use of digital technologies, and it did hasten the adoption of already existing technologies. The pandemic created the space and the motivation, particularly the motivation, for activists to develop a range of technical skills. For example, if someone was setting up a mutual aid group, they had to know how to work Google Sheets. I'll come on to the problems associated with this technology a little later on, but the initial impetus was for people to grasp and try and use the technology. Zoom meetings attracted audience participation in numbers for organizations that were not considered possible before the pandemic. But also Zoom meetings allowed for much smaller, more intimate discussions. YouTube videos using instantaneous translation cut across language and cultural barriers, particularly the case in the farmers' protests in India. And it allowed non-professional journalists to cover the stories and thus giving a louder voice to the protesters. Activists could also see how digital technologies could encourage democratic accountability by allowing for distributed decision-making and dispersed leadership roles. So the technologies were important in building a whole range of different activities. However, as the organizations developed, and this was also the case for many of the other scenarios I looked at, the people using the technologies began very quickly to become aware of the technology's contradictory nature. Yes, Zoom meetings can open up a wider audience for groups that hitherto had a small catchment area, but they also provide a gateway for disruptive and threatening voices forcing activists to therefore having to employ a range of measures to ensure the safety of participants. A successful online presence creates conditions where site organizers or administrators become overwhelmed with extra activity, much of which includes moderating sites to screen out hostile interventions. In this context, as somebody explained to me, Black Lives Matter in New Jersey, she said, our security for offline meetings has to roll over into security and online meetings. Offline and online meld into one in terms of securing meetings. Fact checking is also an issue. We already talked about the circulation of fake news. Well, fake news can be both of a general kind, but also of a quite specific kind. Specific fake news directed at specific protest groups. For example, Minnesota, Black Lives Matter. So fact-checking websites can offer some help, but often it's group administrators who are required to post clarifications on a whole range of issues that adds further burdens to the task of maintaining the integrity of a site. The activists then had to start deal with things like online censorship. Online censorship has been prevalent for many, many years, and governments frequently block news websites and social media domains. Particularly in the Indian farmers dispute and in the Nigerian market protesters, they have been subject to denial of access to the internet, and in terms of the Indian farmers, quite specific areas in and around what was called a Red Fort in a major city in India. The whole area was blacked out. In other words, you couldn't get access to the internet. For the Nigerian market protesters, their Twitter accounts were being blocked. Now, shutdowns of these have become a common feature of internet life as government increasingly uses them as a matter of policy. In fact, it's been estimated that between January and May 2021, for example, there were at least 50 documented internet shutdowns in countries. In other words, 50 governments implemented internet shutdowns in that period. Now then, so those are kind of technical issues, but there were also issues associated with the culture of movements. In one instance, for example, the Sisters Uncut, they explained to me how their group's cohesion and culture had been developed over a number of years, involving a relatively small number of people. What they found was that as the audience developed, then the small community, the ideas and conventions and basically ways of organizing come under stress. Developing a wider audience creates greater levels of responsibility as others begin to seek advice. This is leaving aside the problem about fact-checking or security, but people begin to want to seek advice. They want guidance on how to become involved. This pressure feels as demand, for example, to update Facebook pages and YouTube sites, to monitor constant online traffic, and to keep track of new and existing group members. In other words, what was happening was the culture, the traditions of groups, particularly like small groups, were being undermined. The influx and welcome support, the influx of new and welcome supporters creates a dual problem. How to respond, which it requires an internal discussion with inside a group's founding members, and to what extent can initial principles be maintained. As one interviewee said, in those moments of stress, space for reflection is critical, and digital technologies are not always well suited for such a discussion. Now, the Indian farmers' protest was very successful in that it forced the government to repeal or withdraw its laws, and it shows how protesting repressive legislation can win, but it also shows that digital technologies can be extremely effective when working in tandem, but subservient to more traditional forms of action. Farmers were united in their demands that the Indian government withdraw farm laws, and were extremely well prepared with a significant support, but both home and abroad. I'll go into detail in the book about how that support operated and the kind of massive connection between the protesters at the protest site and the villages from which they came. Sharing the technology linked to a unified purpose to achieve a series of specific demands creates an environment where, as it was in the case of all the interviewees I talked to for this chapter, they start to raise wider questions such as the role of women in society and the consequences of neoliberal economic policies. Okay, another theme to come out of the discussions was access to the technologies. Accessing digital equipment, such as smartphones or computers, was a problem for all the scenarios that I investigated. For others, it was simply a lack of internet availability that was a barrier, or the cost of internet access. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise to any of us who are interested in this area, because since 40% of the world's population has yet to connect to the internet. So these kinds of issues force us to confront the common sense view that digital technologies are going to be at the forefront of solving many of the societal problems. In fact, what the evidence seems to show is that whilst they can be of benefit, there are difficulties. Now, taken individually, you can say that each problem could be solved with specific solution: better training, greater accessibility and optimization, machines with greater processing power, or cheaper internet connections. However, the stories in the book that I produced show that these problems, that the stories can be replicated in scenario after scenario after scenario. In other words, they're indicative of there's something fundamentally problematic about the way we interact with digital technologies. Now, I believe that the real problem with these technologies is the nature of technology itself, not the buttons we press. I'm not talking about that, but because these technologies, taken as a whole, are just like any other commodity, a means to make money which depends on the labor capital relation. And while tech companies seek to manipulate data to line their pockets, they are simply doing what every other capitalist enterprises strives to attain. That's increased profits. Social network platforms are not a social service. They are a mechanism for making money. I could talk about the concentration and centralization of firms controlling digital products if time allowed. But a digital commodity, like any other, has some usefulness. It has to, otherwise nobody would use it. But we really do not have any voice at all in how a commodity will be designed, made, distributed, and used. For example, the Zoom app, which was so useful during the pandemic for many people, that was designed primarily as a business communications tool to compete with Microsoft, Skype, and Google Meet. Its merit will not be assessed on how valuable it will be to enhance or expand our social relationships. For example, helping people with mental health who've got a problem about talking in groups so they can share their experiences online. That will not be a measure of success of Zoom. But the success of Zoom will depend upon the owning company on the stock, the owning company's value on the stock market, which is ultimately contingent upon its inroads into the commercial markets. The digital device, in effect, is a proxy, I would argue, is a proxy for our normally hidden alienated relations with multinational hardware and software companies. We live in an alienated world full of contradictions that no amount of digital smoke screening can hide. Now, is this pessimistic? It does, it sounds pessimistic, but I like to go back, drawing about Gramsci and going back to my experiences in this chapter. They show the emergence of multiple thousands of people who thought they couldn't do things, achieving all kinds of activities, building groups, providing aid, helping protest movements. And so in this process, you get the development of intellectual leaders organically developing out of grassroots level, because they actively participate in practical life. They construct things, they organize things, and they try to persuade people to be involved. And while many of those such as those involved in Sisters Uncut or the Black Lives Matter movement, might feel a bit uncomfortable about this following description, the stories, in my view, show how they simply adopted this role unconsciously and provided guidance and leadership in coping with the pandemic and digital technologies. In doing so, they embraced an accountable style of leadership uncluttered by the problematic dichotomy that poses our well-being against the economic imperatives. Now, to conclude, COVID-19 will not be the last pandemic or catastrophe we will face. The bubbling economic crisis, the ongoing environmental crisis, and the concomitant social and political crises are growing in severity. And our pandemic experience has thrown into sharp relief the struggle about priorities focused on well-being versus profit, and the contradictions associated with digital technologies. It has also shown that during the pandemic, while politicians dithered, and certainly when it came down to things like mutual aid, they certainly did, many others rose to the challenge, sought to use the digital technologies in any which way they could, and in doing so, questioned existing ideas and were prepared to provide a leadership. It was a leadership, as to paraphrase our old friend Spock, it was a leadership, but not as we know it. It was and continues to be built on collective efforts designed to satisfy a real material need. I believe the stories in my book, and there are many, many others which people will have, they will carry a history of the period which is separate from the official story, a history encompassing grassroots activity, and it'll be a history that will show that what we do matters, and that linking theory to our actions enables us to grasp the fundamental impulses driving the confused and contradictory ideas and institutions that dominate our society. We should not be we should be like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. We should pull back the curtain to see exactly what and who is designing these technologies. And thank you very much for listening. I have no idea how long that took.
Thank you so much. We are happy to take any questions. If you have any questions, you can just drop them in the chat section. And if there are in-person questions.
Okay, I'm going to have a cup of tea now.
I can ask a question, Mike.
Okay.
I'm just really interested about how, like, you know, when you see that there is this pattern of like a very much online presence in terms of protest, and you see a huge pushback from the government, and a lot of times it is to curb that information, you know, that with the, is it because, like, one of the possible things that is it that a lot of information will be out there for the world to see? Do you think there is a pattern there, or do you think, like, what are your thoughts on the idea that, you know, that because of with the online world, you have other people, like, you know, you see that the idea that the world is looking out there in terms of what is happening in the country, and what is the response of the government to, let's say, a protest by a minority community? Like, what are your thoughts on that response by the government, like this intense response in today's age?
I think that there's always been, hasn't there? There's always been an attempt by governments to kind of, in a sense, manage the news, if you want to call it that way. And if that means direct censorship, then they will do that. And there has also been an arrangement between the main news outlets and governments, you know, to help manage this news. Now, what the digital technologies have done has created another news mechanisms. And so, for example, taking two instances, I'd like to take a big one and a small one. The big one is the Indian farmers' protests, where, now this was huge by any means, by any standards, massive. And when it first started, it was, they were all using for the journalists to try and get into the Red Fort, which was the centre of the protests. They couldn't do it. They were being stopped. And when they did get in, if they wanted to post their stories, upload their stories, they found that that particular area was stopped from. There was no internet, so they had to then go on a motorcycle. Someone put it to me. It was on a motorcycle, a 20-minute motorcycle ride. But then they found out that local cafes, local shops, with their internet, started to help the protesters. Now that enables the story started to come out. But there's something else that was going on as well, is that in the middle of all of this, some people, and I cover it in my book, developed a thing called a Trolley Times, which was a newspaper. And it was on one Punjabi on one side and Urdu on the other. And they produced this newspaper, and they produced, I think in the first week, they produced a couple of thousand copies. And they found that the people couldn't get enough of the newspaper. So they've got the digital actions going on, hard copy, and that was a recurring theme in all my stories in my book. Hard copy was very important. So you have these two processes going on. And therefore, for the Indian farmers' protests, it was also the way in which there was a continual circulation between the villages and the protest sites that enabled information to be held. And I can go into a little bit more detail about that, about how families used mobile phones. Now, that was one instance. Another instance was the Sarah Everard killing, where the police told women in London, you can't go, you're best staying at home. And this has been a theme that the forces of law and order always say when there's a threat, women are threatened, stay at home and you'll be safe. Many women said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to protest. And so they went to a bandstand in Clapham Common. And then what happened was the police attacked the demonstration at the bandstand. And then what happened, because it was dark and it was nighttime, people couldn't see what was going on. Someone said, turn on your camera phones. So they all turned on their phones, and all of a sudden, the whole area was lit up. People were able to take photos now because of the light. Those photos were immediately uplifted into the internet and went flying around. And that led to Sisters Uncut all of a sudden having an influx of new members and demands upon their work, which created problems for them in terms of how they went about how they were organized themselves. So what you have here is two instances of where there's an attempt to, on one case, the Indian farmers' protest, to directly shut off the message, but were unable to. And secondly, to try and keep people at home and not protest, and people went out and they circulated. And as a result of that, the Sisters Uncut group grew. And now they've got branches. They start with a small group in East London. Now they've got branches all over the place, as far as when I last spoke to them. So it's a contradictory process, isn't it? They try to censor, but the technology allows for an undercutting of that censorship, even though the technology itself then creates further problems for the organisers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, thank you so much for spending time and telling us all the stories. It was really, really interesting. Can we have a round of applause for the speakers?
Read the book.
Thank you.
Get the book.